A light drizzle pattered against Officer James Callahan's windshield as he drove his patrol car down the quiet suburban street. It was late evening, and the fading orange glow of the sunset barely peeked through the thick clouds. The air smelled of damp pavement, and a slight chill crept through the cracks of his window. He adjusted his rearview mirror, rubbing the exhaustion from his eyes. Another long shift. Another day of trying to keep the peace in a world that never seemed to slow down. His hands tightened around the steering wheel as he thought about the past, about the gaping hole in his chest that had never quite healed. 2 years. 2 years since his son, Tyler, had been taken from him. 2 years since that horrible night that shattered his world. Some wounds never close, no matter how much time passes. Every day he put on his badge, he told himself he had a duty, to protect and serve. But deep inside, he knew he was also searching. For what, he wasn't sure. Just as he was about to make a right turn, his eyes caught movement on the sidewalk. A teenager, no older than 16 or 17, walked alone under the flickering streetlights. His hood was pulled up over his head, hands shoved deep into his pockets. Something about the boy made Callahan's breath hitch in his throat. His heart pounded, an uneasy feeling stirring deep in his chest. It wasn't just the way the kid walked, it was something eerily familiar about him. A resemblance that sent a cold shiver down Callahan's spine. Without thinking, he slowed the car, rolling to a stop near the curb. His instincts, sharpened by years on the force, told him to be cautious, but another part of him, a part ruled by raw emotion, whispered something different. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his belt as he approached. "Hey, kid," he called out, keeping his voice firm but not aggressive. The boy hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before facing him fully. And that's when Callahan felt the world tilt on its axis. The boy's face, his eyes, the sharp line of his jaw, even the way he carried himself, was a mirror image of Tyler. His son, the son who was gone. For a split second, Callahan could have sworn he was staring at a ghost. His breath caught in his throat, his pulse roaring in his ears. This wasn't possible. It couldn't be. His mind had to be playing tricks on him. The teen looked just as surprised, his brows knitting together in confusion. Can I help you, officer?" Callahan swallowed hard, forcing himself to steady his thoughts. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice slightly strained. The kid hesitated. "Ethan," he finally answered, shifting uneasily on his feet. "Ethan Carter." The name didn't mean anything to Callahan, but the resemblance, it was undeniable. His stomach churned, and he struggled to find the right words. "What are you doing out here this late?" Callahan asked, keeping his tone neutral. Ethan shrugged, "Just walking home. I live a few blocks from here." There was something guarded in his eyes, something that made Callahan's chest tighten. He wanted to believe this was just a coincidence, that his mind was seeing what it wanted to see. But then he noticed something else, something that made his breath catch in his throat all over again. Dangling from the boy's neck, half hidden beneath his hoodie, was a silver chain. And at the end of that chain was a pendant that Callahan recognized immediately. His son's necklace. His blood ran cold. His vision blurred for a moment as the weight of reality crashed down on him. That necklace had been Tyler's favorite. A birthday gift from Callahan himself. He remembered the day he bought it, the way Tyler had grinned as he fastened it around his neck, promising never to take it off. And yet, here it was, hanging around the neck of a complete stranger. Callahan took a slow step forward, his mind racing with questions he didn't even know how to ask. "Where did you get that necklace?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Ethan's fingers instinctively reached up, touching the pendant as if suddenly aware of its presence. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, hesitation, maybe even fear. "It was my brother's," Ethan finally said. His voice was quiet, almost uncertain. He gave it to me before he." He stopped short, his jaw tightening. Callahan's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. His hands felt clammy, his head spinning. "Your brother," he repeated, barely able to get the words out. Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, he died a couple years ago." His voice cracked slightly on the last words. "I never met my real dad. He left before I was born. But my brother always said he wished he could find him one day." The streetlights buzzed softly above them, casting long shadows on the pavement. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world seemed to narrow down to just the two of them, standing beneath the dim glow of the streetlights, connected by something neither of them could yet understand. Callahan's throat tightened, his hands trembling at his sides. The possibility that had been creeping into his mind now screamed at him with undeniable force. This wasn't just some strange resemblance. This wasn't just some wild coincidence. This boy, Ethan, was connected to his son in a way he never could have imagined. And as he looked into Ethan's eyes, so much like Tyler's, he knew one thing for certain. His life was about to change forever. The night air hung heavy between them, thick with something neither could name. Callahan's pulse hammered in his ears as he tried to process what he had just heard. Ethan's words echoed in his head. "He died a couple of years ago. Never met my real dad. My brother always said he wished he could find him one day." It was like the ground beneath him had cracked open, leaving him teetering on the edge of something far bigger than he was ready for. Ethan shifted, uneasy under the cop's stare. His fingers played with the silver pendant, his movements hesitant, almost nervous. He looked like he was waiting for what Callahan didn't know. Maybe an explanation. Maybe a way out of this conversation. Callahan finally found his voice, though it came out rough, unsteady. "Your brother, what was his name?" The hesitation was brief, but it was there. Ethan swallowed hard, as if saying the name alone carried weight. "Tyler," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something inside Callahan clenched so tightly he thought he might collapse right there on the sidewalk. It was like being punched in the gut, like the air had been sucked from his lungs. He had prepared himself for anything except that. The name, his son's name. Callahan took an unsteady breath, forcing himself to stay composed. He couldn't just come out and say what was racing through his mind. Not yet. He needed to understand. Needed answers. "Where did Tyler get that necklace?" he asked, his tone carefully measured. Ethan hesitated again. I don't know exactly. He always had it. Said it was from someone really important to him. He never took it off. His eyes flickered with something, pain, maybe loss. When he passed, I took it. I guess I just wanted to keep a part of him with me." Callahan's throat tightened. He didn't need to ask any more. He already knew. That necklace had been his gift to his son. A piece of his love, something Tyler had promised never to take off. And now it sat around Ethan's neck, like some kind of ghostly reminder of what had been lost. But if Ethan was telling the truth, if Tyler was his brother, then that meant. Callahan squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second, his mind spinning. He had no other kids. Not that he knew of, but the timelines matched. If Tyler had a brother, then somewhere, somehow, there was a piece of his past he had never known. "Ethan," he said carefully, studying the boy's face. "Who was your mother?" Ethan's expression shifted, guarded now, cautious. "Why do you care?" Callahan hesitated. He had to tread carefully. He couldn't just blurt out what was swirling in his head. If this was what he thought it was, If this kid was connected to Tyler in the way it seemed, then Ethan deserved to hear the truth the right way. "I knew Tyler," Callahan finally admitted, his voice low. "He was my son." Ethan's face paled. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He looked like he had just been hit by a truck, like the world had shifted under his feet, just as violently as it had for Callahan moments ago. "That's not possible," Ethan finally whispered. "My mom, she never talked about Tyler's dad. She never even mentioned him." Callahan's heart pounded. What was her name? Ethan took a step back, his eyes flicking toward the street like he was debating running. He clearly didn't trust Callahan, not yet. But something in his expression said he was just as desperate for answers as Callahan was. After what felt like an eternity, Ethan finally spoke. "Lisa Carter." The name sent another wave of shock through Callahan's system. Lisa. He knew her. Years ago, long before he had settled into the steady, predictable life of a cop, he had loved a woman named Lisa. They had been young, reckless, full of fire. But life had pulled them apart. He had gone off to the academy, throwing himself into his career, and she had disappeared. He had never heard from her again. Until now. Ethan's eyes locked onto his, full of confusion and something else, something dangerously close to hope. "You knew her." Callahan swallowed hard, nodding. His hands felt numb at his sides. "Yeah," he admitted. "A long time ago." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Callahan wanted to ask 100 questions at once. Where was Lisa now? Had she ever tried to find him? Had she known about Tyler's connection to him? And most importantly, had he really had another son all these years and never known? Ethan was staring at him like he was trying to piece something together. His fingers clenched the pendant tightly, his knuckles white. "If Tyler was your son, does that mean?" He couldn't even finish the sentence. The weight of it was too much. Callahan exhaled shakily. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I think we need to find out." Ethan didn't respond right away. His shoulders were stiff, his expression unreadable. Finally, after a long moment, he nodded. "Yeah," his voice was quiet, but steady. "I think we do." And just like that, the world that Callahan thought he knew had changed forever. The weight of everything pressed down on Callahan as he sat in his patrol car later that night, staring blankly at the dashboard. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel, his mind racing with questions that had no easy answers. Lisa Carter, Ethan, Tyler. Somehow, all of it was tangled together, and he had spent years unaware of a truth that had been right in front of him. Ethan had agreed to talk, but not here, not on the sidewalk under the cold streetlights. Instead, they decided to meet at a nearby diner, neutral ground, a place where the weight of the conversation wouldn't feel so suffocating. Callahan had offered to drive, but Ethan refused, insisting he would meet him there. The kid still didn't fully trust him, and honestly, Callahan didn't blame him. Now, as he sat waiting in the parking lot, his stomach churned. The smell of coffee and fried food drifted through the air every time the diner door swung open, but he had no appetite. The only thing on his mind was Lisa, where she was, what had happened, and why she had never told him the truth. The bell over the door jingled, and Callahan looked up to see Ethan walking in, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. He looked tense, guarded, but there was something else in his expression, determination. He slid into the booth across from Callahan, barely looking up as the waitress poured them coffee. Neither of them touched their cups. "I called my mom," Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was tight, like he was holding something back. "She didn't want to talk about it." Callahan exhaled slowly. He had expected that. Lisa had kept this secret for a reason, and she wasn't going to give it up easily. But Ethan continued, eyes locking onto Callahan's. I pushed her. I told her I met you. He hesitated, like he wasn't sure if he wanted to say the next part. She started crying. Callahan's chest tightened. He couldn't picture Lisa crying, at least not the version of her he remembered. She had always been tough, independent, never the type to let anyone see her break. She admitted it, didn't she? Callahan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded, his jaw clenching. Yeah, he hesitated. She said you didn't know. That she found out she was pregnant after you left. She wanted to tell you, but by the time she worked up the nerve, you were already gone. He swallowed hard. And then she met my dad. Well, the guy I thought was my dad. He raised us both. Tyler always knew, though. He always knew he wasn't really his son. Callahan felt like the air had been knocked out of him. All these years. All this time, believing that Tyler had been his only child, only to find out he had another son walking around, carrying his brother's necklace like a lifeline. She should have told me, Callahan muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. Yeah, well, it's a little late for that now, Ethan said, his voice sharper than before. There was hurt in his eyes, hurt that Callahan recognized. He took a slow breath. You're right. He met Ethan's gaze. I can't change the past, but I can be here now, if you'll let me. Ethan stared at him for a long moment, then glanced down at the necklace, running his thumb over the pendant. Tyler always said he felt like something was missing, he murmured. Like he was supposed to know something or someone. I think it was you. The words hit Callahan harder than he expected. He swallowed the lump in his throat, his eyes burning. I would have been there, he said, voice thick with emotion. If I had known, I would have been there. Ethan nodded slowly, like he was trying to believe it. A long silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't empty. It was filled with understanding, pain, loss, but also something new. Something that hadn't been there before. Possibility. Finally, Ethan sighed, shaking his head with a small, almost amused smile. So, what now? Callahan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. I have no idea. He paused, then added, but maybe we figure it out together. Ethan considered that, then nodded. Yeah, maybe we do. And in that moment, sitting across from each other in a worn-out diner, neither of them had all the answers. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't alone.